Hey guys, thanks for tuning in. My name is Patrick Edel, and this is a process video where we're going to go over the sketch to finish process for my most recent piece, the Mage's Market. Before we go any further, I want to give a shout out to my buddy HAILEN Jackson. The music you're hearing in the background throughout the video is from his most recent album titled Drift. He's a musician based out of Utah, and everybody should be listening, so we're going to link him in the description of the video or wherever we're putting links for this video for resources. Everybody should definitely check him out. Big thank you to HAILEN for the tunes. So without further ado, we're going to dive in. I've been streaming this process on Twitch, so I've just compiled all of the different streams and sped them up and compressed it into a little time-lapse thing. So I'm just going to kind of freewheel it, jump in, just talk over the video. Hope you guys enjoy, and hope you're able to learn something. Alright, so we're just going to jump right in here. What you're seeing on the screen is the point where I had started streaming this process. I didn't start from the blank canvas. I kind of figured out a little bit of the sketch first before I jumped into the stream. But basically, the very first thing that I did in the sketch stage was lay in the grid, and the grid is really important for me in my crowd work and in a lot of my illustrations that have that kind of top-down perspective. The grid allows me to kind of figure out what the plane is that I'm working with. Like if it was a perfect square grid, you'd see it would be like a top-down. So I kind of tilt the grid a little bit, and that gives me a good idea of what the space is that I'm working with and what the plane is that I'm working with. If I'm doing something with a hill, I can tilt the plane a little more for the hill. Most of the time it's one plane though, so that's the first thing that I kind of laid in there. And then the second thing that I did after I figured out the plane is I went in and I just blocked out the big shapes of the tents. In this illustration, this is my first illustration that I'm working entirely digital with my new pen display. I got an XP Pen Artist 22E Pro recently, and I find it to be pretty great for this kind of work. My only real complaint with it is that the colors are a little washed out, but like you can't really beat the Mac Retina screen that I'm used to working with. So overall, it's pretty responsive to pressure, and the line is really accurate. So I found that it was pretty nice to make the transition from working on paper to working digitally. So yeah, so the first thing that I did with this piece was I put the plane down, and then the second thing that I did was I blocked out the big shapes of the different stalls. The idea of this piece is that it's a market, kind of like a farmer's market, but instead of farmers selling their stuff, you've got different types of magical people selling their things. So the place that I'm working on right now in the video is the potion seller, who he's a recurring character from another piece that I did around this time last year, the alchemist. So I got that guy, and then there's a dude selling runes that he's getting worked on right now. There's a bookseller selling magical ancient tomes and things like that. There's a conjurer, and then there's like a miscellaneous enchanted goods seller. So yeah, at this point in the video, I'm kind of doing a little bit of the big blocking in plus detailing, which is a lot of the times I work on my sketch stage and my inking stage at the same time. Those are the first two stages in my drawing, because it does help me kind of feel like things are permanent once I've inked them. So in this drawing, the big important pieces of the drawing are the stalls. Those are the second thing I do after I lay the grid is I subdivide the space. So in this one, I've subdivided the space into the open space and then the space that's being taken up by the stalls in the buildings, which are not going to have any crowd and not going to have any characters in them. So right now at this point in the video, I'm working on doing some detail in those stalls and laying in that line work, getting that kind of out of the way, because everything else in the piece is going to revolve around those stalls. Those stalls are kind of the anchor, and everything else is going to kind of sit around the anchor. And in a lot of my work that deals with crowd scenes, there are anchors, and those anchors are usually a little bit bigger, and everything else kind of sits around them. And usually those are the first things that I figure out when I'm doing a crowd scene is what are the anchors going to be, and how am I going to like set up a believable space with those anchors. Because once those are set up, it makes it a lot easier to place the figures that are going to really make up the wowness of the piece. Everyone's going to say like, oh, that there's 50, 60, 100 little dudes in here. That's incredible. That's mind-blowing. Whoa. But really what allows that to exist is the believable space and the anchor stuff. So yeah, at this point in the video, I'm kind of working on those stalls, and I'm sketching, but I'm also inking at the same time because the anchors are kind of the most important piece. So yeah, I've placed my grid, and now I'm like subdividing the space pretty much, and getting all that stuff figured out. In this piece, I did it a little bit more segmented than I usually do. Usually, I do the whole drawing with my blue line pencil, but because I'm working digitally, I'm trying out a couple of new techniques, and one of the techniques is overlapping a lot of stuff on different layers, because normally when I do the ink drawing, I don't have different layers. So if something, if a figure is in front of a wall, I need to draw the figure in the wall, but I can't draw the whole wall, or I can't draw the whole wall behind the figure. I kind of have to make up the space behind the wall and like think about it. But in this piece, because I have layers, I could literally draw all the details and then draw the figure in front of it and kind of erase what the figure ends up obfuscating. So I thought it would be kind of interesting to see how that would work in relation to how I normally work. Right now I'm working on the book stand, just kind of like making up the characters as I go. The beanbag chair was a fun addition there. Yeah, so specificity is important, and that's something I don't usually dig into in the sketch stage. Usually it's big shapes, and it's like blobs that represent what a figure is going to look like. But because of the flexibility that I'm allowed by working digitally, I'm able to kind of do the specificity when I feel like it. And that's kind of nice. It's kind of nice, for sure. So yeah, these are the big shapes, those stalls. There's the big house to the right, the big inn to the top right of the piece, and then the house to the left, and there's kind of a wall along the top. And those are my bounding shapes. Usually I don't like to have the detail go right to the edge, because when someone's looking at your crowd drawing, they're going to be drawn to the areas of high detail. So you'll notice along the edges that there's not a lot of detail pulling your eye away from the center, because you want people to kind of stay within your image. And so in this piece, I've got that big town wall, kind of stone wall along the back, and then some buildings with a little bit less texture and a little bit less detail along the edges. I think that kind of creates like a border in a lot of ways. That's not specifically a border, but keeps the eye in there. So yeah. Now I'm working on the conjurer's stall, just kind of laying in that specificity and laying in that detail. You can be like someone who does crowd drawings, but if all your buildings are just, rectangles, and if all your characters are just kind of like generic people, I find that the crowd drawing can be kind of boring, and like that's kind of where Where's Waldo loses me in a lot of ways sometimes. Crowd drawings of that ilk, they tend to exist in a very realistic space, and that's interesting, but it doesn't make me want to stay with the piece and really digest the piece. So I'm doing a lot of design in this piece, especially within the stalls, because it would be kind of boring if all the stalls just had crates and barrels and that's it. So I'm trying to like do some specificity and do some environmental storytelling. I didn't do an insane amount of it, but there is a little bit there for sure. You know, crystal ball with a smiley face, little cardboard boxes mixed with. Those are like kind of a little bit of a joke. The cardboard box, along with the like in this medieval village type thing. But yeah, we're doing a lot of carpet designs and cool things. At the conjurer's tent, we'll have actual things being conjured. But yeah, so part of what is to be considered when you're doing all your compositional placement is the crowd is also one of those big shapes. But it's kind of more fluid in a lot of ways. Like, these tents are going to be rigid shapes, and then once they're kind of figured out, all the negative space that isn't assigned anything is going to get a figure in it. So there's going to be a lot of negative space around the fountain and leading up and out of the town and down out of the corner that's going to be filled with figures. The crowd is also a shape. So we've got, you know, our 6 or 5 tents or whatever, our border buildings, and then we've got the big space in the middle that's going to have all the figures. So yeah, we're just kind of laying in, just again doing as much detail as we can at this stage and trying to really figure out those anchor buildings, get them nice and fleshed out. And you can see like a lot of the process, it gets kind of changed up from what the original sketch was, and that's because I start with a big shape and a vague idea, and then as I work I kind of chisel away at it until it gets to a point where it feels like it has character and it has specificity. So as I'm building up right now, building up the wand stand, I added this like counter with draws and all these like mounted staffs and stuff because it feels more like before it was just a tent, but then when I decided it was going to be a wand cellar, you kind of go in and start adding details that add to that character. And I think if you're adding details just for the sake of details, it can kind of fall apart. But if you're adding details because they actually reveal a little bit about the character, that can help tell the story of like who this character is and why they're out there selling their stuff. So, you know, that's important. A lot of these two guys, their tent is like an enchanted items tent. So there's like a dude selling some enchanted fruit, and I don't know. Gotta put the jars down, put the rugs down, all that stuff. Do all the detail, and that stuff is going to be what really makes it feel like it's a place that exists and not just like I said before, random crates and random barrels and things like that. So yeah, here you can see the cobblestone just kind of suddenly appeared. I didn't stream that step of the process because I found it to be... Oh, there's another piece I've been working on. I found the cobblestone to be like incredibly repetitive. So, but basically what I did for the cobblestone was I sketched out a big rough shape and then I just drew the pattern on another layer, and I guess there's not really much more to talk about. I didn't stream it, so I don't have the recording of that, and so we're just gonna jump right ahead into the character design stage. So yeah, this is where I kind of am playing with the format of digital a little bit more for the first time. Up until this point, I'd been working kind of as I normally do with kind of a sketch and then like inking on top of it. But this time around, I am just kind of doing everything on like a separate layer and designing all the characters kind of in the same way that I did with pen and pencil, but it's like a separate process at this point because all the inking had already been, all the inking for the tents had already been done, so now this is kind of like existing as its separate step. So it's like sketching the tents and inking the tents is one step, like my anchor points that I mentioned before. That's going to be like your first step, and then your second step is going to be filling those negative spaces with characters. And so when I'm doing the crowd drawing here, it's focused on, it's like a separate step, and I found that to be kind of nice. It allowed me to focus a little bit more on building the environment in the first step and less on like having to crowd that environment, and I found that to be kind of nice. I'm a little used to kind of building the environment and crowding it at the same time. So yeah, we're working on doing different character designs, and I'm just kind of like loosely throwing them in at this point. There's not really a ton of specificity because this is like the sketch layer for the characters, and the character stage is always the most fun for me. I get to kind of just make a shape and then try to figure out how I can make that character. I think this is a point where I was having some issues with Photoshop that I then figured out because of one of my Twitch streamers telling me how to use the program. But yeah, so I get to kind of like look for like open spaces in the piece and try to figure out how I can fill that space with something interesting. One of my design philosophies with the characters in these pieces is to try to never repeat a character, unless you have a good reason to. Like later on, that character with the sword on the left does get repeated, just because I thought it'd be nice if he had a buddy. But yeah, so we're just kind of filling up the space. And what's nice about this stage is that it is a very loose part of the drawing. So you can kind of just throw down shapes and it doesn't really matter what those shapes are, because you could just kind of make a face on it and then now it's a character. This is fun for this project too because it's all wizards, so everything here is magical and the characters can all be magical. I think this can be a trickier kind of way of working when you are doing something maybe for a client. They're like, we want it to just be, a crowd at a basketball game or something, because then the most wacky you could do is maybe like a character that is a basketball. You're not going to be doing some kind of like weird pile of dung or like a cube with a hat on or something. So it's nice to pick a fantasy setting and just kind of let loose. But yeah, I guess all that stuff kind of depends on who the client is or what the job is or what the illustration calls for. And in this one, I think it works pretty well to just have like kind of random crazy characters. I'm trying to throw in some different characters who maybe would be shopping at the Mage's market, like other than magic people. So there's a couple of warriors in there, some like adventurers, things like that. But it's fun to just kind of make here's more Photoshop issues. It's fun to just kind of like make up the characters, and you don't have to get too in-depth with like a story or anything like that. You can just kind of be like, oh, this is like vaguely a magician, and he's just going to be doing magic stuff, I guess, at the magic market. In a lot of my bigger crowd drawings, this one I would consider kind of small. It's 11 by 14, I think, is the size that I'm working with, and it's kind of just one scene. But in a lot of my larger crowd drawings, so here's another time skip. We're going to be getting into the coloring process now, but that time skip is basically after I finished the stream where I was throwing down all the characters, I did all the detailing and shadows on a separate stream, and now I'm like kind of going crazy showing that to everybody. I didn't do it on a separate stream. I did it on my own. I didn't stream it because it was just like detailing on top of characters that were already there. So I don't have any recording of the lining of those characters. But basically I did the line art, and then I went in and I erased the cobblestone out. And I erased out what the figures were blocking from the line drawing. And then before this stream, I came up with a kind of cuckoo bananas color palette wheel. and then built out like 18 color palettes because I was just bored and having fun with colors. But this is kind of like not how I normally work with colors. I thought I'd do something a little funny or a little interactive for the Twitch stream. And as you can see, I'm trying out a lot of different color palettes right now and just kind of fill bucketing. I don't really have a color philosophy overall with my work. There's a couple of like rules that I try to stick to when I'm working, but overall I just kind of like go with my gut and go with a palette that feels like it fits. So I already abandoned like 2 different color palettes and I'm just like laying in colors now. And usually I'll block in the colors and use the paint bucket to swap things until it feels right. And then I go in and I clean up the blocked in colors. I think with this one I was trying to work off of color palettes from that color wheel, but yeah, it's not really working for me at this point. One of the big things that I was trying to do was, and I always try to do this with my crowd drawings, is you want to differentiate the crowd from the environment. You don't have to do that, but if you kind of like step back from a piece and the crowd isn't separated from the environment, you squint and you look at it, you're just gonna see a big blob of like nothing, and you want to be able to differentiate things. And in a detailed line drawing, you're not going to have as many opportunities in the line drawing to build up your composition and your visual hierarchy, because every piece of the page is going to have some kind of detail and some kind of line. So you can build up some small spots of contrast, like I have done that with the areas of black. Those are drop shadows. Those serve to pop the figure forth, but they also serve as little pockets of contrast that you kind of can bounce around between. But so I usually leave like compositional stuff for the coloring stage. And so at that point I had just been kind of messing around and not really feeling like any of the color palettes were cohesive, and I think I was enjoying the greens and the blues, so I decided to go and kind of try out just dropping in a ton of greens and blues. And that's how we ended up with the color palette that we eventually got to. As you can see, I'm like swapping out colors right now in the piece, changing it up. Grabbed a couple of colors from that other piece that I had open. And yeah, we're just kind of swatching stuff and figuring out what works. I ended up really liking the greens and the blues. They remind me of the Breath of the Wild's color palette, which is really fun and full of liveliness and energy. My original idea going into this was that I wanted it to be candy colored and to pop a lot. But then as I moved through those palettes, I found that they weren't working the way that I thought that they would work, and they just weren't sitting right in my gut. So I decided to go ahead with the greens and blues. And then I decided on yellows and reds for the figures. This is like kind of a basic trick with colors, but if you have everything monochrome and then one thing or like a couple of elements in a different color, it's just going to pop that forward. So the background and the tents and all the cobblestone and everything are these cool blues and greens. So to pop the figures forward, you make them warm. You make them red, you make them yellow, you make them orange. So I started laying in those colors and just blocking it out, and it was working a lot better for me. That being said, I was also like very close to the screen and working zoomed in, so a good tip is to always zoom out and kind of squint and look at it and make sure that it's not just working close up, but that when you zoom out, you are getting that sense that there's not just like a big blob of different colors, and that there is, there is like some differentiation and hierarchy between the background and the foreground, or rather the background and the crowd. Here I'm just like dropping in some overlays to see how they look with the colors. I sometimes at the end of a piece, if I feel that the palette's not as cohesive as I'd like it to be, I will drop a super simple overlay over it to just kind of tie everything under one bandana. That can work, and it can also not work sometimes. It really depends on the piece. But yeah, in this piece I decided on yellow because yellow was kind of the unifying color between the reds, oranges, and yellows, and then the greens and blues, and it kind of made everything feel a little bit warmer, which is nice. But yeah, so we're getting into some specificity. I think I'm talking about stuff right now in the video, but it's nice. It's fun to do the coloring stage. It's probably one of my favorite stages. It's also one of the most time consuming. This part in the video, I'm like talking about an internship experience. I had to draw out the diagram, but yeah. So you have to really kind of sketch everything and drop all the colors in and see how it looks. I'm like kind of nutty. I do all my colors on one layer. I think a lot of people are always surprised when they see that. I don't think a lot of people work that way. But for me, I usually, my piece will be like 3 or 4 layers. Line art on one layer, maybe a second piece of line art on another layer, and then that's about it. So, and then colors on a 3rd layer, maybe some overlays, but I don't get too crazy. So at this point now I'm getting into really cleaning up that color, and this is probably one of the most time-consuming parts of the drawing. It's definitely not the most efficient way of doing it. I think this part took me about 4 hours, but I find it kind of relaxing, and when time allows it, I do prefer to do it this way. It gives me more minute control over like what exactly is going where. A lot of people say like, oh, why don't you fill bucket? But I don't fill bucket because sometimes when I'm doing my line drawing, I don't close the shape completely. This was definitely more of an issue when I was working with ink on paper and then scanning it in. Now that I do everything digitally, I'm looking for ways to kind of fix my process and make it a little bit more efficient. Maybe not fix, but definitely like make it more efficient. So yeah, I'm basically just going in and kind of coloring and cleaning things up. It's kind of like a zen thing for me to do. I do enjoy this aspect of the piece a lot. Yeah. And now you guys are going to get to see kind of like a close-up of where we're at. But yeah, so a lot of times in my bigger crowd drawings, I think I started to talk about this before, and then the video went on to the next section. But in my bigger crowd drawings, to keep it interesting to look at, I try to build small scenes within the crowd drawing. So there's like your macro image, but then there's like micro scenes. I didn't do that a ton in this piece because it is on the smaller side for one of my crowd drawings, but dealing with the macro and micro storytelling is a fun thing for me to do because it not only makes it more interesting to like look at the piece and stay within the piece, but it also makes it more interesting to draw because I get to like tell a big story, but then as I'm getting tired of the big story, I could tell a smaller story. I remember on a piece I did back in 2017, it was like a 10-foot long crowd drawing, and it took like 2 months. It was for a school assignment, and I just wanted to have fun with it. So there's the overall story. It was like a war thing, and like a fight. I don't know how to talk about it. It's on my website. Check it out. Sometimes Fish Walk is the name of the piece. But to keep it interesting, I would just like put small vignettes in the piece. But this one's on the smaller side, so I don't have to create those vignettes to keep it interesting because it does have its own cohesive story to it, and adding those smaller things would probably make it a little bit more messy. So yeah, we're just kind of going in. I'm gonna block off the image on the top right for this stream, but because it's Twitch, you can just like throw up windows of things that are not related to anything, so that'll get blocked out. There's my dog. I had to add her in, bottom left. She's a little gem. But yeah, so definitely some ways that I could speed this process up or to use the paint bucket tool, or like magic wand tool or something to select things and just drop them in, but I find that works in some scenarios and then it doesn't work in other scenarios. So I would rather just do everything the same way, make it feel consistent. Like, I don't know, if I was using the paint bucket, I'd probably have to, like, work on the same layer as my line art, which I don't really like. A lot of times, and you'll see it towards the end of this video, but I like having the line art on its own layer because I can lock the transparency of that layer and change the color of the line art, which is nice because black line is always strong, but sometimes it makes for a more cohesive palette to have like a deep green or a deep blue line, and have that be your darkest value. So yeah, I'm just kind of going in with the brush that I use is just the default round brush. The brush that I use for the line art and for all the sketching is a brush from Kyle Webster's pack. It's like the comic pen nib size 8 or something. I have all of his brush packs from like 2 years ago, and I haven't done enough experimenting with them because I really only use the round brush for coloring, and up until I got this display, coloring was the only digital aspect of my process. I really did everything else by hand. So I'm interested in trying out a couple of his other brushes now that I have this display that I can work on directly into Photoshop instead of having to kind of work on the table and look at the screen with the Intuos tablet, which is what I used to use. So definitely want to experiment a little bit with that, get kooky with it. But for this video, I used the comics pen nib because it gives like just the slightest bit of texture, so you can still do all your detail, but the edge of the line is just a little bit rough, which is nice because I think when you use just the hard brush, the hard round brush, and make it tiny, it feels very, very digital. It's a very minuscule thing, but it feels very like, this is not a line drawing, this was like made by a computer, which I've done in a couple of my pieces before. So yeah, we're just kind of coloring stuff in. One of my rules with coloring, and it's not a hard rule, it doesn't always kind of maintain, but I try not to use the same color near any other color. There's this principle with coloring that is used in cartography where you can basically take any like image and color it with just 4 colors and not have those colors touch at all. So obviously I'm using more than 4 colors, but the minimum amount of colors that I would use in something like this is 4. I'm glad that I ended up going with this blue and green palette because it's a little calming and it does feel a little mystical, which is kind of nice. Like it feels a little otherworldly. I wanted that candy colored pop palette originally because I wanted it to feel otherworldly, but I think the green gives it kind of like a sage like quality, something a little it's like a different kind of mystical. And then yeah, the yellows and the reds were they were working for me, but I definitely, my favorite colors in that are the bright pink that you see there and the bright red. I'm not super into the yellows. Which is fine, but like later on I go in and change it. So yeah, as you can see, I'm trying to keep the grass and the mud super light because, again, like one of the things with a detailed line drawing is that your darkest value is going to be the line, and so you don't want, when you're doing the line art, your line should be like 80% to 100% black in terms of like its value, because that's going to be the most specific thing. That's going to be like where all the detail is and what you want people to be looking at. So that should be the darkest thing. So when you're coloring, you don't want to obfuscate your line art in any capacity, because then it's like you put all this work into this detailed thing and then you use like a dark blue to color it and you lose all the detail. So my rule for coloring is line art should be 80% to 100% black, and your colors shouldn't pass 50% in that value scale. Once they do start to pass that 50%, you're going to start losing your line drawing, especially like the bigger the line drawing is and the smaller your details are. So it's definitely important to keep your line art on the lighter side of things. So yeah, I'm just about wrapping up all the coloring on this piece. Here I'm changing the color of the line a little bit, just testing stuff out. These are all like the last little tweaks that I do in the piece, um, just to like kind of try out different ways of finishing it and like changing the atmosphere a little bit. I ended up not being super happy with the yellow, so I ended up changing the color palette, and I don't know if, yeah, we'll get to that. I'm dropping in some paper texture. I like to do a little bit of like finishing stuff, um, like dropping in textures and things. So yeah, here's where I switched the color palette. I didn't record switching the color palette, but I went with the purples and blues because I thought that it would be a little bit more mystical, and I found the yellow to be a little bit jarring. Yeah, if you might have missed it, you might want to rewind a little bit, but there's a point where I zoomed in and you could kind of see, now it says done, and I'm just gonna throw the piece back up there, and talk a little bit more, but basically I wanted to get this like glow effect, so one of my friends kind of showed me how to do the glow. It's super simple. You just copy your color layer, and then thanks for and then so you copy your color layer, do a Gaussian blur, and then set the blurred layer to 50% opacity, and that gives you like a kind of glowing effect. I changed the color palette to this blue and purple and pink because it felt a little more mystical, and then when I added that glowing effect, it really like sent it home in terms of like a little bit funky, a little bit magic, not too much, but yeah. And then I also laid in a paper texture on top, super light, and I did a unifying overlay on that. So, because a lot of times my palettes will have that cohesion to it in terms of like it makes sense. Like I've got my blues, I've got my pinks, I've got my reds, like whatever, got my greens, but setting that overlay kind of unifies the color just a little bit. I don't want it to be too saturated because I don't want the colors to feel like overwhelmingly the same color. I still need that differentiation between my reds and my greens, but having a slight reddish paper texture on top of it on a multiply layer really helped kind of pull it together in the end. So that's the process video. I hope you guys liked it. I hope you gleaned a little bit of my process and how I build the space and lay in characters. And definitely again, thank you to HAILEN for the music. Check him out. We will link him in the descriptions, and check me out on Instagram, and yeah, make a crowd drawing of your own. I would love to see what kind of crowds everybody is missing during the lockdown, since we're all kind of isolated. Crowd drawing can be a kind of therapeutic way of remembering what we used to have long ago. Take care, everybody. Stay safe, stay healthy, and we will be cheering you on. Ciao.